Chapter 2, Unit 2, Rhetorical Situation. 2.1. Understand rhetorical situation. Let's start with a question. Have you ever texted your best friend about a problem differently than you'd explain the same problem to your mom? Maybe you used slang with your friend, a little sarcasm, maybe a meme reference, and then with your mom you were a little more careful, a little more formal. Maybe you left out the part about the party. That instinct you have, that ability to read the room before you even open your mouth, that is rhetorical awareness. And on the AP language exam, that awareness has a name, the rhetorical situation. What the rhetorical situation actually is, the College Board defines the rhetorical situation as the context in which communication occurs, the set of circumstances that surround any act of writing or speaking, and that shape what a writer does and how an audience receives it. Think of it like the invisible architecture behind every piece of writing you'll ever encounter on this exam. Before a writer puts a single word on the page, the rhetorical situation already exists, waiting to guide every choice they make. The AP exam breaks the rhetorical situation into 5 interconnected components, and you need to know all 5 cold: speaker or writer, audience, purpose, subject, and context, sometimes called exigence or occasion. The College Board most commonly uses the acronym SOAPS: speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and you may see slight variations in phrasing, but the underlying framework is always the same. Know it both ways. Breaking down each component. The speaker is not just the author's name. This is a critical distinction the exam loves to test. The speaker is the constructed voice or persona the author projects, the version of themselves they choose to present in this particular piece of writing. A sitting senator writing a campaign speech and that same senator writing a letter to their grandmother are technically the same human being, but rhetorically, they are 2 different speakers. When you analyze speaker on the AP exam, you're asking, what kind of person does this writer present themselves as? What values, experiences, and credibility do they claim? This connects directly to ethos, which you'll dig deeper into in Unit 3, but plant that seed now. The audience is who the writer envisions reading or hearing the text, and again, this is more nuanced than it first appears. The intended audience is not always the same as the actual audience. A political speech is delivered to a crowd, but written with television viewers and newspaper editors in mind. You need to think about who the writer assumes is reading, what that audience already believes, what they value, and what they need to be convinced of. When the AP exam asks you to analyze how a writer considers the needs and interests of the audience, they want you to identify specific choices in the text, word choice, examples, tone, that reveal those assumptions. The purpose is the writer's goal, what they want to accomplish. This goes beyond they want to inform or they want to persuade. That's too vague for a score of 5. Purpose should be precise. A writer might want to shame an institution into changing a policy, to reassure a frightened public, to challenge a widely held assumption, or to celebrate a person's legacy. Notice how each of those is specific and action-oriented. When you write about purpose on an FRQ, try to use a precise verb: to challenge, to urge, to commemorate, to expose rather than a generic one. The subject is simply what the text is about. It sounds like the easiest component, but students constantly mix up subject and purpose. The subject is the topic. The purpose is what the writer wants to do with that topic. An op-ed might have climate change as its subject and to convince city councils to adopt green infrastructure policies as its purpose. Keep them separate in your analysis. The occasion or context is perhaps the richest component. Occasion refers to the time, place, and circumstances that prompted the writing in the first place. What event, crisis, or moment made this piece of writing necessary? The occasion includes the immediate trigger, a speech given the day after a tragedy, an essay responding to a new law, but it also includes the broader historical and cultural moment. Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" has an immediate occasion of 4th of July celebration and a broader context, antebellum America, the ongoing institution of slavery, the abolitionist movement. Both layers matter. The components work together not in isolation. Here is where students most often lose points. They treat SOAPs like a checklist instead of a web. The AP exam is testing whether you understand how these elements interact. The speaker's credibility shifts depending on the audience. The purpose shapes what aspects of the subject the writer chooses to emphasize. The occasion constrains what purposes are even possible. When you write an FRQ analysis, you're not meant to define each term and move on. You are meant to show how a writer's choices respond to and reflect the entire rhetorical situation simultaneously. Think of it like a theatrical performance. The script is the subject, the playwright is the speaker, the theatergoers are the audience. The purpose is to move them to tears, or to laughter, or to political fury. And the occasion is opening night in New York in 1953, right at the height of McCarthyism, which changes everything about how that script lands. Arthur Miller's The Crucible is a perfect real-world example. The subject is the Salem witch trials, but the occasion is McCarthy-era America, and those two layers are inseparable from understanding what Miller is doing and why. Common MCQ traps to watch out for. The AP exam will frequently present you with an answer choice that correctly identifies the subject of a passage when the question is asking for the purpose, or vice versa. Slow down and reread the question stem carefully. Another classic trap: confusing the stated audience with the intended audience. A text might be addressed to one group, but actually designed to persuade a different group entirely. That's called a surrogate audience, and recognizing it is a sign of sophisticated rhetorical thinking. Finally, watch out for questions that ask about the speaker's credibility or persona, and then offer the author as an answer choice alongside the speaker. On the AP exam, always prefer the more precise rhetorical term. Connections to the rest of the course. Everything in this course branches out from the rhetorical situation. When you study appeals in Unit 3, you're examining how a writer uses ethos, pathos, and logos to accomplish a purpose for a specific audience. When you study claims and evidence in Unit 4, you're looking at how writers structure arguments in response to an occasion. When you write your own synthesis and argument essays in Units 8 and 9, you are yourself entering a rhetorical situation, and the exam rewards you for showing awareness of it. The rhetorical situation is not just a concept to define, it is the lens through which everything else in AP language is read. With that foundation in place, you're ready to move into exactly how writers use specific techniques to navigate that rhetorical situation, which means it's time to talk about the tools of claims, evidence, and reasoning. 2. The SOAPs/Soapstone framework for analyzing rhetorical situation. Imagine you've just received a letter in the mail. Before you even read the first sentence, your brain is already doing something remarkable. It's scanning for context. Who sent this? Is it handwritten or typed? What's the return address? You're asking questions instinctively because you already understand on some level that meaning doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every piece of communication has a context that shapes how it lands. That instinct you already have? The College Board has given it a name: rhetorical situation analysis. And the most reliable tool for doing it systematically is the SOAPs or Soapstone framework. Breaking down the acronym. SOAP stands for subject, occasion, audience, purpose, and speaker. Soapstone adds 2 more letters, tone and effect, making it an even more complete analytical lens. Both versions appear in AP exam materials, so you need to be comfortable with either label, but don't let the slight variation trip you up on the exam. The underlying concepts are identical. Think of soapstone as soaps with a pair of powerful finishing moves added at the end. Let's walk through each component the way your favorite professor might explain it over a cup of coffee, because each one deserves your full attention. Speaker is not simply the author. This is a distinction the College Board tests aggressively, and it is one of the most common traps on the multiple choice section. The speaker is the constructed voice or persona within the text. It's the rhetorical identity the author chooses to project. A journalist writing an editorial might adopt the persona of a calm, rational expert, even if they personally feel furious about their subject. That persona, its credibility, its apparent values, its relationship to the audience, is the speaker. Always ask, what kind of person does this text present itself as coming from? What credentials, biases, or experiences does that persona seem to carry? Occasion refers to both the immediate context that prompted the text and the broader cultural or historical moments surrounding it. Think of it as having two layers: the exigence, which is the specific triggering event or need, and the larger context that gives that event its weight. Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" was occasioned by an invitation to speak at a 4th of July celebration. That's the immediate occasion. But the broader occasion is the entire antebellum debate over slavery in a supposedly free nation. Understanding occasion tells you why this text exists right now, and on the FRQ, demonstrating that layered understanding earns you scoring credit that vague students leave on the table. Audience is who the text is designed to reach and persuade. Notice I said designed to reach. The intended audience may be different from the actual readership. A presidential speech is technically delivered to Congress, but rhetorically aimed at the American public watching on television. On the exam, identifying audience requires you to look for clues inside the text, the vocabulary level, the assumed shared values, the references that are explained versus left implicit, the types of evidence selected. A text that uses technical jargon without definition assumes a specialized audience. A text that opens with a shared cultural touchstone is signaling community with a specific group. Your job is to be a rhetorical detective. Purpose is the speaker's goal, what they are trying to make the audience think, feel, or do. College Board language distinguishes among purposes carefully. A text might aim to inform, to persuade, to entertain, to move emotionally, to inspire action, or to commemorate. Many texts blend purposes, and that nuance matters enormously on the FRQ. A common mistake students make is reducing purpose to a single word like persuade without explaining toward what end and through what means. Instead, try framing purpose as a complete sentence. The speaker seeks to persuade a skeptical general audience that environmental regulation protects economic growth, not just wildlife. That precision is what separates a score 3 response from a score 5. Subject is the topic, the actual content being discussed. This sounds almost too simple, but subject analysis goes deeper than just naming the topic. You're looking for how the subject is framed, what aspects are emphasized or omitted, and how the chosen framing serves the speaker's purpose with a particular audience. Two texts can share an identical subject and produce completely opposite rhetorical effects based on framing alone. Tone is the speaker's attitude toward the subject and the audience, as expressed through deliberate stylistic choices, word choice, syntax, imagery, and structure. Tone is not just a mood label like angry or hopeful. College Board expects you to use precise, nuanced tone words and critically to anchor them to specific textual evidence. Tone is directly connected to Unit 3 material on figurative language and to Unit 4 on style. So when you're doing soapstone analysis, you're building the scaffolding that supports your close reading skills across the entire course. Effect, sometimes called theme in certain framings, refers to the overall impact the text has or is designed to have on the audience, including the broader message or insight the text communicates about the human experience. Effect connects your local analysis to the big picture and is often where synthesis appears. What does this text make you understand or feel that you didn't before? Effect is the answer to, so what did all of this rhetorical work accomplish? How this shows up on the exam? The AP exam will test soapstone analysis most directly through the rhetorical analysis, FRQ, where you'll be expected to demonstrate how rhetorical choices, all of which trace back to these components, work together to advance a purpose. Readers are not looking for you to list soapstone elements robotically. They want to see you synthesize them. How does the speaker's established ethos interact with the occasion to make a particular appeal more powerful? How does the tone shift reveal something about the relationship between speaker and audience? A critical boundary condition to watch for on the multiple choice section. Questions will sometimes present two similar answer choices, one naming the speaker and one naming the author. Remember, unless the text is explicitly autobiographical, prefer the choice that acknowledges the rhetorical persona being constructed. Conflating author and speaker is one of the exam's most reliable traps. One more connection to lock in. Soapstone doesn't stand alone in your toolkit. It forms the foundation of Unit 2's broader exploration of rhetorical situation, and it feeds directly into Unit 3's analysis of the appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos, and into Unit 6's synthesis essay, where you're analyzing multiple texts across multiple rhetorical situations simultaneously. Every framework you learn in this course builds on what you're learning right now. With Soapstone firmly in your analytical grip, you're ready to take the next step. Understanding exactly how writers build credibility, create emotional connection, and construct logical arguments through the classical rhetorical appeals, which is precisely where we're headed next. 2.3 Understand the writer's choices in a rhetorical situation. The big idea. Writing is always a decision. Imagine you're texting your best friend about a party, then 5 minutes later emailing your principal to request permission to hold that same party at school. Same information, completely different message. You didn't think twice about it, you just knew to change your language, your tone, your structure. That instinct you have, that's rhetorical awareness in action. And in AP English Language and Composition, your job is to name it, analyze it, and demonstrate it with precision. Section 2.3 is where the rhetorical situation, which you explored in earlier sections as a framework for reading texts, becomes a framework for understanding why writers make the choices they do. College Board wants you to see every text as a series of deliberate decisions. The writer didn't just write words. They made choices, and each choice was shaped by the situation they were writing into. Your job on both the multiple choice and free response sections is to connect those choices to their rhetorical purposes with sophistication and specificity. The 5 elements, now through the writer's lens. You already know the 5 components of the rhetorical situation: exigence, audience, purpose, context, and the writer themselves, sometimes called the speaker. In 2.3, you're shifting your perspective. Instead of asking, what is the rhetorical situation, you're asking, given this situation, why did the writer make this choice and not some other one? Think of it like this. A chef doesn't just throw ingredients in a pot randomly. They assess the occasion. Is this a weeknight dinner or a wedding reception? And then they make deliberate choices about flavor, presentation, and portion. Every decision serves the goal. A writer works the same way. The rhetorical situation is the occasion. The writer's choices are the recipe. Those choices fall into 3 major categories that you need to internalize completely. What the writer says, content and evidence, how the writer says it, style, tone, structure, syntax, diction, and why those specific choices serve the particular audience, purpose, and context at hand. The AP exam will test all 3 dimensions often simultaneously. Diction, syntax, and tone as strategic tools. Let's zero in on style choices, because this is where students often lose points by being too vague. When you notice that a writer uses short, declarative sentences in the opening paragraph, don't just say they use short sentences. Ask, why does this choice work here? Short sentences create urgency. They command attention. They mirror the blunt reality the writer wants the audience to feel. That connection, choice to effect to purpose, is what earns you full credit on the AP exam. Diction is your single most powerful analytical tool. Word choice isn't decorative, it's argumentative. A politician who refers to undocumented immigrants as illegal aliens versus one who calls them undocumented workers is making the same factual reference but an entirely different rhetorical move. Each word choice signals a relationship with a particular audience and advances a particular purpose on the FRQ. When you identify diction as a rhetorical choice, College Board's rubric expects you to explain how that specific word or phrase functions within the broader rhetorical situation, not just what it means, but what it does, syntax. The arrangement of words and clauses works in similar ways. A periodic sentence, one that withholds its main clause until the very end, builds suspense and emphasis. A cumulative sentence which front-loads the main idea and then piles on modifying phrases creates a sense of abundance or overwhelming evidence. When writers use anaphora, repeating the same phrase at the beginning of successive clauses the way Martin Luther King Jr. did with "I Have a Dream," they're creating rhythm and unity to move an audience emotionally. Each of these syntactical choices is a response to the rhetorical situation. The trap students fall into. Here's the most common MCQ trap for this section, and it costs students points every single year. Confusing identifying a device with explaining a choice. The exam will give you an answer option that correctly names a rhetorical device. Say, the author uses a metaphor, but then offers an explanation that misreads its purpose in context. Students grab the familiar term and miss the wrong purpose completely. Always read the full answer option, including the explanation of effect. The device alone isn't enough. It has to match the function within this specific rhetorical situation. A related trap on the FRQ is writing what AP readers call a device dump, listing every literary and rhetorical term you can spot without connecting any of them to the writer's purpose or the rhetorical situation. The rubric explicitly rewards a line of reasoning that is supported and explained, not merely cataloged. One well-analyzed choice, traced carefully from the text to the purpose to the audience effect, is worth far more than 5 devices named and abandoned. Genre and medium as choices too. Don't overlook the fact that the form of a text is itself a rhetorical choice. A writer who chooses to respond to a public controversy through a newspaper op-ed is making a different strategic decision than one who posts a Twitter thread or publishes a peer-reviewed article. The genre signals credibility, reach, and relationship with the audience. Medium shapes what's even possible. Length, visual elements, interactivity, permanent. On the AP exam, when a passage is identified as a speech, a letter, a political cartoon caption, or a magazine essay, that label is not incidental. It's a clue about what constraints and opportunities the writer was working within, and you should factor it into your analysis. Connecting to the rest of the course. This section is the analytical engine for everything that follows. In Unit 3, when you study how writers make arguments, you'll be building directly on this framework, because every argumentative choice, evidence selection, appeals to ethos, pathos, logos, is a response to the rhetorical situation. In Unit 4 and 5, when you write your own synthesis and rhetorical analysis essays, College Board is asking you to do exactly what 2.3 trains you to do. Make deliberate choices in your own rhetorical situation and analyze the deliberate choices of other writers. The skill loops from reading into writing and back again throughout the entire course. The critical habit to build right now is asking 3 questions every time you encounter a text. What choice did the writer make here? What alternatives did they not choose? And why does this particular choice serve this particular rhetorical situation? Master that loop, and the AP exam becomes far less mysterious. Next, we'll move into how writers use evidence and appeals to build credibility, advance arguments, and persuade their specific audiences, which is where the rhetorical choices you've just learned to identify really start to do heavy lifting. 2.4 Understand how audience influences rhetorical choices. Let's talk about something you already do every single day without even thinking about it. When you text your best friend, you probably use abbreviations, inside jokes, maybe a string of emojis that would mean absolutely nothing to anyone else. But when you email your teacher asking for an extension, you shift gears completely. You use full sentences, a respectful tone, maybe even a formal greeting. You've just made a series of rhetorical choices based on your audience. That instinct you already have, the AP exam wants you to analyze it with precision and name it with the right vocabulary. What audience really means in AP Lang? In AP English Language and Composition, the College Board uses a very specific framework for thinking about rhetorical situations, and audience is one of its core components. Your audience is not simply the reader or whoever picks up the text. For exam purposes, you need to think about audience in at least 3 layered ways. First, there's the intended audience, the group, the writer is consciously crafting the message for. Then there's the invoked audience, the audience the text itself constructs or calls into being through its language, assumptions, and tone. This is a crucial distinction. A writer might intend to reach suburban parents concerned about school safety, but the rhetoric of the text, its elevated vocabulary, its allusions to policy literature might actually invoke a more educated, policy-oriented readership. The gap between those two things is often where the most interesting analysis lives, and it's exactly the kind of nuance that earns you full credit on an FRQ. Finally, you should be aware of the actual audience, the people who actually encounter the text, which may differ significantly from either of the above. How audience shapes every rhetorical choice. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to. Think of a skilled chef preparing a meal. The ingredients don't change. Flour is still flour, salt is still salt. But a chef preparing a birthday cake for a 5-year-old is going to make wildly different choices than one preparing a tasting menu for a table of food critics. The chef isn't being dishonest, they're being rhetorically intelligent. Writers do the same thing. When a writer considers their audience, they make decisions across every dimension of a text. Diction, word choice shifts dramatically based on what a writer assumes the audience already knows. Scientific writing directed at fellow researchers is dense with field-specific jargon because the audience has the background to decode it. The same research written for a general magazine audience gets stripped of that terminology and replaced with accessible analogy. Neither version is dumbed down or inflated, each is calibrated. On the AP exam, when you encounter a passage, one of your first analytical moves should be to ask, what does the writer assume this audience already knows, values, and believes? Syntax and structure. Also respond to audience. A speech delivered to a crowd of fired-up activists uses short, punchy sentences, anaphora, and rhetorical questions, because those structures create energy and participation. A legal brief uses long, subordinate, clause-heavy sentences because its audience expects exhaustive qualification and precision. Neither is better writing in the abstract. Both are excellent writing for their specific audiences. Appeals and evidence shift too. A writer addressing a scientifically literate audience will lean heavily on data, statistics, and peer-reviewed citations, logos-heavy rhetoric. A writer addressing a community that shares a particular faith tradition might invoke shared scripture or moral principles, a form of ethos grounded in communal values. An op-ed written to grieving parents might lead with a heartbreaking personal anecdote before introducing any statistics, pathos first, then logos. The choice of which appeal to lead with is almost always a function of who's in the room. The AP exam's key terminology and what you must be able to do. The College Board expects you to do 3 things with audience on the exam. You need to identify the audience, intended or invoked. You need to explain how specific rhetorical choices are tailored to that audience, and you need to analyze the effect of those choices, meaning you explain not just what the writer does, but why it works, or how it positions the audience to receive the argument. A common MCQ trap here is conflating the topic of a text with its audience. A piece about climate change is not automatically written for environmentalists. A piece about veterans is not automatically written for veterans. Always look at the rhetoric itself, the diction, the assumptions embedded in the text, the evidence chosen to determine who the writer is actually speaking to. Ask yourself, who would recognize these allusions? Who would feel validated by this evidence? Who would be persuaded by this tone? Another trap involves oversimplification. Students often write something like, the writer uses simple language because the audience is uneducated. That framing is both analytically weak and potentially inaccurate. A better framing, the writer uses accessible direct language to reach a broad general audience, prioritizing clarity over technical precision. The second version respects the writer's strategic intelligence and avoids making a condescending assumption about the audience. Edge cases you'll encounter: be especially careful with texts that have multiple audiences. A presidential speech, for instance, is delivered to a live crowd but simultaneously broadcast to millions. A corporate annual report is technically written for shareholders but is also read by journalists, employees, and regulators. In these cases, you may need to identify the primary audience, the one most directly addressed by the dominant rhetorical choices, and acknowledge secondary audiences where relevant. The FRQ scoring rubric rewards complexity, and noting that a writer navigates competing audiences shows sophisticated analysis. Also watch for texts where the writer miscalibrates to their audience, where the rhetoric doesn't land because the writer misjudged who they were speaking to. This is rarer on AP passages, which tend to feature skilled writers, but it can appear in argument tasks where you're asked to evaluate effectiveness. Connecting audience to the broader rhetorical situation, audience never exists in isolation. It's always in conversation with the other elements of the rhetorical situation you studied in earlier sections of Unit 2. The writer's purpose is almost inseparable from audience. You can't fully understand what a writer is trying to do without knowing who they're trying to do it to. The context shapes audience too. The same text published in 1920 versus 2020 reaches a completely different audience with completely different assumptions and experiences. And the exigence, the urgent problem or occasion that called the text into being, often determines who the relevant audience even is in the first place. This interconnectedness is actually your analytical superpower on the FRQ. When you can show that a writer's diction choice serves both the intended audience and the overall purpose, and that it's shaped by the historical context of the text, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of multi-layered thinking that earns a 5. As you move into the next section, you'll see how all the elements of the rhetorical situation, including audience, come together to explain why writers make the specific choices they do at the level of the text itself. 2.5. Understand how purpose influences rhetorical choices. Let's talk about something that sits at the absolute heart of AP language: the relationship between purpose and rhetorical choice. Think of a writer as a chef. Every dish a chef prepares depends entirely on the occasion. A wedding cake and a bowl of instant ramen are both food, but the ingredients, the techniques, the presentation, everything differs because the purpose differs. Writing works the same way. The moment a writer decides why they're communicating, that decision starts driving every other choice they make: the words they pick, the structure they build, the evidence they use, the tone they adopt. That's what this section is about. What purpose actually means and how College Board defines it on the AP exam. Purpose refers to the writer's reason for writing, the goal they want to achieve through their text. College Board expects you to distinguish between different kinds of purpose with precision. The most common purposes you'll encounter are to inform, to persuade or argue, to entertain, to commemorate or celebrate, to satirize, and to call to action. Here's the critical thing. A piece of writing almost never has just one purpose. A eulogy informs the audience about someone's life, celebrates that person, and offers comfort all at once. Your job on the exam is to identify the dominant purpose and then trace how it shapes the rhetorical choices the writer made. Notice that College Board deliberately separates purpose from claim or thesis. Purpose is broader. It's the overarching goal. A writer's claim might be that the city should fund public transit, but the purpose is to persuade city council members to take action. Keep that distinction crisp in your mind, because MCQs love to blur it. How purpose shapes every rhetorical choice. Here's where things get genuinely fascinating. Imagine two writers both discussing the opioid epidemic. One is a journalist writing for a general news audience with the purpose of informing. The other is a public health advocate writing a congressional testimony with the purpose of persuading legislators to change policy. Same topic. Radically different rhetorical choices. The journalist will likely choose neutral, objective diction, words like reported, documented, data suggests. They'll use third-person perspective, cite statistics evenly, and present multiple viewpoints without explicit judgment. The structure will probably be chronological or inverted pyramid. Now, look at the advocate. They'll choose emotionally charged diction, crisis, devastation, our neighbors, our children. They'll use first-person plural to create solidarity. They'll deploy personal anecdote early to build pathos before layering in statistics as logos. The structure will build toward a climactic call to action. Same facts, same issue, but purpose reshapes everything from the first word to the last. This is exactly the kind of analysis the FRQ rubric rewards. When you're writing a rhetorical analysis essay, examiners want you to connect specific choices to specific purposes. Saying the author uses vivid imagery earns you nothing. Saying the author uses visceral imagery of physical deterioration to make the abstract statistics of addiction feel personally threatening, thereby advancing her persuasive purpose, that earns you points. Recognizing how purpose interacts with audience and context. Purpose never operates alone. College Board asks you to understand the rhetorical situation as an interconnected system, and on the exam you will frequently need to show how purpose, audience, context, and exigence work together. Here's a useful mental model. Think of purpose as the direction a writer is trying to travel, and audience as the terrain. You don't pack the same gear for a beach trip and a mountain climb. A writer whose purpose is to persuade a hostile audience must make fundamentally different choices than one persuading a sympathetic crowd. That's why Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address reads so differently from a campaign rally speech. Same goal of unifying the country, but the tone, the biblical allusions, the careful syntax all reflect an audience that includes both allies and former enemies. The most common MCQ traps on this topic. Let's be direct about where students lose points. The first trap is conflating purpose with subject matter or topic. If a passage is about climate change, to discuss climate change is not a purpose, that's a topic. Purpose involves a verb of intent, to argue that climate change demands immediate policy response, or to explain how greenhouse gases function. Always frame purpose with an active infinitive. The second trap is choosing to inform as a default when a passage actually persuades. Many persuasive pieces are written in calm, measured tones precisely to seem neutral and informative. That's a rhetorical strategy, not evidence of purpose. Ask yourself, does the writer want you to simply know something, or does the writer want you to believe, feel, or do something? That distinction separates informative from persuasive purpose every time. The third trap is ignoring tone as evidence of purpose. Tone is one of the clearest signals of purpose on the page. Ironic, satirical tone almost always signals a purpose of critique or social commentary. Elegiac, mournful tone signals commemoration. Sharp, urgent tone signals a call to action. When you're analyzing an FRQ passage, map the tone early. It will point you toward the purpose like a compass. Applying this to your FRQ writing. When you write your rhetorical analysis essay, structure your analysis around purpose explicitly. A strong thesis should name the author's purpose and gesture toward how the rhetorical choices serve that purpose. Something like, in this address, Roosevelt deploys a pattern of antithesis and collective pronoun usage to transform individual fear into national resolve, serving his overarching purpose of galvanizing a demoralized public. That's a thesis that earns points. In your body, paragraphs always complete the circuit. Identify the choice, explain the effect, connect the effect back to the purpose. No open circuits. Examiners reading your essay are looking for that final connection. Without it, your analysis stays at the surface level, which caps your score. Connections to other units. This concept threads through the entire course. In Unit 3, when you study claims and evidence, you'll see that the kind of evidence a writer selects, empirical data, personal testimony, expert authority, is directly shaped by purpose. In Unit 4, on argumentation, you'll analyze how classical, Toulmin, and Rogerian structures each serve particular persuasive purposes with particular audiences. And when you reach synthesis in Unit 7, your own writing purpose will govern which sources you select and how you frame your argument. Purpose is the through line that holds everything in AP language together. Think of this section as handing you a master key. Once you can identify purpose and trace its influence through a text, almost every other analytical skill in this course becomes easier, because you'll always know why each choice is on the page. With a firm grasp of how purpose shapes rhetorical decisions, you're ready to zoom in on one of its most powerful tools, the way writers deliberately construct their tone to connect with or challenge their audiences. 2.6. Understand how context influences rhetorical choices. Let's talk about context, and I want you to think about this word the way you'd think about the air in a room. You can't always see it, but it determines everything. It shapes what feels comfortable, what feels suffocating, what's possible. Context works exactly the same way in rhetoric. It's the invisible force that determines why a writer chooses certain words, a certain tone, a certain structure, and why those same choices might completely fail in a different situation. Mastering this concept is one of the most powerful things you can do for the AP exam, because it shows up everywhere, in the multiple choice passages, in the synthesis essay, in the rhetorical analysis FRQ, and absolutely in the argument essay. What context actually means, the College Board defines context as the circumstances, conditions, and setting that surround a text and influence how it is written and received. Think of it this way. Imagine you're writing a text to your best friend about how nervous you are before a big game. Now imagine writing that same emotional content in a formal letter to your school board requesting extended practice time. Same feeling, same underlying situation, completely different rhetorical choices. Why? Context, the relationship between writer and audience, the formality of the occasion, the purpose of the communication, the medium. All of these are contextual factors that push a writer's decisions in particular directions. For the AP exam, you need to distinguish between three major types of context: historical and cultural context, social and political context, and immediate rhetorical context. These often overlap, but being able to name and discuss them precisely is essential for earning full credit on the FRQ. Historical and cultural context refers to the time period and cultural milieu in which a text was produced. When Frederick Douglass writes his 1845 narrative using formal, elevated diction, that's not an accident. He's making a deliberate rhetorical choice in response to his context. He knew that white readers in antebellum America would dismiss his work as inauthentic if it didn't demonstrate sophisticated command of written English. His language is a direct response to the racist assumptions of his historical moment. You must be able to explain not just what choices an author makes, but why those choices make sense given the world the author was writing in. Social and political context is about the power relationships, social norms, and political realities that shape what can be said and how. Think of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. Delivered at the end of a devastating civil war, Lincoln could have written a triumphant, punishing speech. The social and political context, a nation torn apart, a need for reunification, pushed him toward magnanimity and religious resonance instead. The famous phrase, "malice toward none, with charity for all," is comprehensible only when you understand the context demanding reconciliation rather than retribution. The immediate rhetorical context, soaps, and the exigence. Here's where this connects tightly to what you've already studied in Unit 2, the rhetorical situation itself. The immediate rhetorical context is essentially the moment-to-moment situation a writer is responding to. Who is the speaker? Who is the audience? What is the occasion? What is the subject? What is the purpose? You may have seen this as the SOAP's framework. The exigence, that urgent problem or gap that makes the communication necessary, is also part of this immediate context. A text is always a response to something. Your job as an AP student is to trace the line from contextual pressure to rhetorical choice. Here's the trap most students fall into on the FRQ. They identify a rhetorical choice and then describe it without connecting it to context. They'll write something like, "Lincoln uses an inclusive tone," which earns no points by itself. What earns points is the connection. Lincoln uses an inclusive tone, both parties appearing multiple times, because the social and political context of 1865 demanded he address Northern and Southern Americans as members of a shared national community rather than as victors and defeated enemies. Context explains the why. The why is where the points live. How context shapes tone, diction, structure, and appeals. Context doesn't just influence what you say, it shapes every layer of how you say it. Consider tone. A eulogy at a funeral for a close friend carries a deeply personal, emotionally resonant tone because the occasion and audience call for vulnerability and warmth. A legal brief about the same person's estate would demand formal, dispassionate precision. Same subject, different context, radically different tone. Diction word choice is perhaps the most context-sensitive element of all. Writers operating in contexts where their authority is challenged, like Douglass, or like a young person writing to an older, skeptical audience, often reach for elevated, formal diction to establish credibility through the words themselves. Writers addressing audiences who are already persuaded might use more accessible conversational language to build solidarity rather than authority. On MCQs, you'll often be asked why an author chooses specific words. The answer almost always lives in context, in the relationship between writer, audience, and occasion. Structure is equally context-driven. A persuasive op-ed written during a national crisis might front-load its most urgent claim because readers are skimming and the context demands immediacy. A philosophical essay written for a scholarly journal might build methodically toward its thesis, because that audience and occasion reward careful, logical development. Noticing how structure responds to context is a sophisticated analytical move that can push your FRQ score from a 4 to a 5. Common MCQ traps to watch for. The most common trap on MCQs for this topic is confusing what the text says with why the rhetorical choices were made. Answer choices that describe a technique without anchoring it to a contextual purpose are almost always wrong. If an answer says the author uses formal diction to show intelligence, that's weak. If it says the author uses formal diction to address the skepticism of an educated audience resistant to the argument, that's thinking about context, and that's the right answer. Another trap is assuming context only means historical background. Remember, context includes the immediate rhetorical situation, the medium of publication, the anticipated audience's beliefs and biases, and even the genre conventions that shape reader expectation. A tweet operates in a completely different contextual ecosystem than a sermon, even if they're making the same point. Connections to other units. This concept threads through everything in the course. In Unit 3, when you analyze claims and evidence, you'll need to understand how context determines what counts as credible evidence for a particular audience. In Unit 5, when you study style, you'll see how context governs stylistic choices at the sentence level. In the synthesis essay, which draws on multiple sources across different contexts, you'll need to explain how different authors' contexts shaped their perspectives on a shared issue. And in your own argument essay, your awareness of your audience's context should shape every choice you make about tone, evidence, and structure. Context, ultimately, is the lens through which all rhetorical choices become legible, and with that foundation in place, you're ready to zoom in on the choices themselves as we turn next to analyzing how writers develop their arguments through evidence and reasoning. 2.7. Understand how exigence shapes a rhetorical situation. What is exigence? Exactly. Let's start with a scenario. Imagine you're sitting in class on an ordinary Tuesday, and suddenly your phone buzzes with a news alert. A massive storm is heading toward your city. Within minutes, the mayor is giving a press conference. Emergency services are posting on social media, and your school is sending automated calls to parents. All of that communication, every word of it, didn't just happen randomly. Something triggered it. That trigger? That's exigence. Exigence, pronounced ek-sigens, is one of the AP terms that College Board uses very specifically, so you want to get this right. The word comes from the Latin exigere, meaning to demand or drive out. In rhetorical terms, exigence refers to the event, problem, crisis, or condition that prompts a speaker or writer to communicate in the first place. It is the why now of any rhetorical act. Rhetorical scholar Lloyd Bitzer, whose 1968 essay, The Rhetorical Situation, essentially gave us this whole framework, defined exigence as an imperfection marked by urgency, something that needs to be addressed, fixed, responded to, or changed. Here's the key phrase you need to lock in for the AP exam. Exigence is not just any event. It is an event that calls for a response, and that can be addressed through communication. This distinction matters enormously on multiple-choice questions, so hold on to it. Exigence as the engine of the rhetorical situation. Think of the rhetorical situation, which includes the speaker, audience, purpose, context, and message, as a car. If that's the car, then exigence is the ignition. Nothing moves without it. When you analyze any text on the AP exam, one of your first moves should be asking, what happened that made this piece of writing necessary? Why did this person sit down and write or speak right now rather than never? Take Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The exigence is layered but clear. Thousands of soldiers have just died on that Pennsylvania battlefield. The nation is ripping itself apart, and there is a dedication ceremony for a military cemetery happening that very day. Lincoln isn't just speaking because he felt like it. He's speaking because the moment demands speech. The deaths demand acknowledgement. The fractured nation demands reassurance. The ceremony demands purpose. That convergence of urgent circumstances is the exigence, and everything about his word choice, his brevity, his elevated tone flows directly from it. Or consider something more immediate. A student writes a letter to the school board arguing against new lunch policies. The exigence is the school board's pending vote. Remove that vote, and there's no letter. The urgency of the moment, the fact that the decision hasn't been made yet, is precisely what makes the communication possible and meaningful. This is a crucial edge case you'll encounter on the exam. Exigence must be something that rhetoric can actually address. If the storm has already passed, if the vote has already happened, the moment of exigence has closed. A speech delivered after a crisis is resolved operates on a different exigence, perhaps the need for reflection or healing, but it's no longer the same rhetorical situation. How exigence shapes every other element. Here's where things get really interesting for your exam analysis, and where a lot of students lose points on free response questions. Exigence doesn't just explain why a text exists, it actively shapes the speaker's choices about audience, tone, structure, and evidence. When you write an AP essay and you're asked to analyze rhetorical choices, exigence is the lens through which those choices become meaningful. Consider a public health official responding to an outbreak of food poisoning. The exigence, people are sick, the source is unknown, panic is spreading, demands immediacy. That exigence shapes everything. The official speaks directly and plainly because ambiguity would be dangerous. She addresses the public broadly because the audience is anyone who may have eaten at the affected restaurant. She leads with action steps because the urgency of the moment requires practical response, not philosophical reflection. If you're analyzing her press release and you say she used simple language to be clear, that's weak analysis. If you say the urgency of the exigence, an active, unresolved public health threat, demanded clear, direct language to prevent further harm before the situation could be contained, that's a scoring point on the AP rubric. The most common exam traps. Let's talk about where students go wrong, because this is a concept that sounds simple but hides some tricky exam moments. The first trap is confusing exigence with topic or subject matter. The topic of Lincoln's address is the Civil War. The exigence is the specific convergence of circumstances. The battlefield dedication, the war's continued brutality, the crisis of national identity that demanded that particular speech at that particular moment. Exigence is always time-sensitive and situationally specific. Topic is not. The second trap is treating exigence as purely negative. Students often assume exigence must be a problem or crisis, but it can also be a positive opportunity or milestone. A graduation speech has an exigence, the occasion of completion, the transition to a new chapter, the gathering of a community that wants to be inspired and acknowledged. The exigence isn't a catastrophe, but it's still a specific, urgent set of circumstances that calls forth the speech. College Board multiple-choice questions will occasionally test this by presenting celebratory or ceremonial text and asking you to identify the exigence. Don't be thrown off when the exigence isn't a disaster. The third and trickiest trap is confusing exigence with purpose. Purpose is what the speaker wants to accomplish. Exigence is what prompted the communication. A senator's purpose might be to persuade colleagues to vote for a bill. The exigence might be a recent high-profile tragedy that has suddenly made the issue urgent and timely. They're related. Exigence often informs purpose, but they are distinct elements of the rhetorical situation. On free response questions, using these terms interchangeably will cost you precision points. Connecting exigence across units. Exigence connects directly to your work in Unit 3 when you analyze how writers build claims and evidence. Because the strongest arguments are almost always rooted in the urgency of their exigence, they make readers feel that something must be done, and now. It also links to your synthesis work in Unit 7, where you'll draw on multiple sources to respond to a prompt. Understanding that each source was itself written in response to a specific exigence helps you evaluate its perspective, its limitations, and how it fits into a larger conversation. Anytime you're reading a text on the AP exam, the first question you should whisper to yourself is, what made this necessary? The answer to that question unlocks everything else. Now that you have a firm grip on exigence and how it sets the entire rhetorical situation in motion, let's turn to examining the role of the audience. Because once a writer knows why they're speaking, the next question becomes who they're speaking to, and that shapes everything about how the message gets built. 2.8. The role of the speaker-narrator in a rhetorical situation. Let's talk about one of the most fascinating puzzle pieces in the entire AP Lang toolkit, the speaker. Think of yourself as a detective for a moment. Every time you read a text on the AP exam, someone is talking to you. But who is that someone, really? And why does it matter so much? That's exactly what we're unpacking today. And I promise you, once you really get this concept, you'll start seeing it everywhere, in everything you read. Defining the speaker, not the author, not the narrator. Here's the first trap students fall into, and it shows up constantly on multiple-choice questions, confusing the speaker with the author. These are not the same thing, and the College Board is watching to see if you know the difference. The author is the real, flesh-and-blood human being who put pen to paper. The speaker, what AP Lang also calls the rhetorical persona, is the constructed voice that author has deliberately built and deployed for a specific rhetorical purpose. Think of it this way. When a novelist writes a villain's monologue, the author hasn't turned evil. They've created a speaker to serve the work. In nonfiction, even when a writer seems to be speaking directly as themselves, they're still making choices about tone, persona, what to reveal, what to withhold, that shape a crafted version of themselves for rhetorical effect. The College Board defines the speaker as one of the 5 key elements of the rhetorical situation, alongside purpose, audience, context, and exigence. Every element connects to the others, so keep that web in mind. The speaker doesn't exist in isolation. Who the speaker is shapes what they can say, how they say it, and whether the audience believes them. Ethos and the speaker's credibility. Now the speaker connects directly to ethos, one of the 3 classical appeals you'll see throughout the entire AP Lang course. When you analyze a speaker, you're largely asking, how does this speaker establish credibility and trustworthiness? Does the author position the speaker as an expert, a witness, a concerned citizen, an outsider? Each choice does rhetorical work. Consider how a doctor writing an op-ed about vaccine safety might open by establishing their medical background. They're not just sharing information, they're constructing a speaker persona that signals, I have authority on this topic. By contrast, a personal essayist writing about grief might downplay expertise entirely and lean into vulnerability and lived experience, because for their audience and purpose, emotional authenticity is the credibility. The speaker construction changes depending on what rhetorical work needs to get done. A crucial AP exam move is recognizing not just that ethos is being built, but how it's being built, and why that particular construction suits the audience and purpose. That analytical so what is what separates a 3 from a 5 on the free response questions. Persona, tone, and distance. The speaker also controls tone, which is the emotional and attitudinal coloring of a text. Here's a useful way to think about this. Imagine the speaker as an actor, choosing a costume before going on stage. A speaker might adopt a tone that is detached and clinical to signal objectivity, or warm and colloquial to build intimacy with the audience, or urgent and impassioned to convey the weight of exigence. The choice of persona, who the speaker performs themselves to be, directly produces the tone the audience receives. On the AP exam, you'll frequently be asked to identify tone words and explain how the speaker's choices create them. The edge case to watch for. Sometimes a speaker adopts a tone that seems to contradict their stated purpose, often for ironic or satirical effect. In Swift's A Modest Proposal, the speaker is constructed as a perfectly reasonable, dispassionate policy analyst, and that detachment is precisely what makes the satire so devastating. The mismatch between speaker persona and actual content is the rhetorical device. Don't be fooled into describing the tone as simply calm without connecting it to the satirical purpose. The speaker's relationship with audience and context. You cannot analyze the speaker in isolation. The speaker is always in relationship with an audience, and always operating within a context, the historical, cultural, and situational circumstances surrounding the text. The same speaker making the same argument will construct their persona differently for different audiences. A climate scientist writing for Nature versus writing a public letter to a local newspaper is still the same human being, but the speaker they construct, the level of assumed expertise, the vocabulary choices, the degree of formality will shift dramatically. This is a key connection to Unit 2's broader focus on rhetorical situation. Every element informs every other element. When you see an AP exam question asking why an author uses a particular word choice or adopts a specific stance, you should be thinking about the speaker in the context of the full rhetorical situation. Ask yourself, who is this speaker presenting themselves to be, and how does that construction serve the purpose given this audience and this context? Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. Let me flag the traps that show up most reliably. First, avoid conflating the author's biography with the speaker's constructed ethos. When asked about the speaker, stay in the text. Second, watch out for questions that offer the author is telling the truth about their experience as an answer choice. That's an author claim, not a rhetorical claim. Third, be careful with first-person narration in essays. Just because an author uses I does not mean the speaker and author are identical. They may be playing a constructed persona. For the FRQ, especially the rhetorical analysis essay, the scoring rubric rewards you for explaining the function of the speaker's choices, not just identifying them. Don't write, the speaker uses an authoritative tone. Write, the speaker constructs an authoritative tone through formal diction and the citation of empirical data, which establishes credibility with a skeptical, educated audience, and supports the essay's central argument that policy change is necessary. That's the difference between a surface-level observation and an argument that earns commentary, points on the evidence, and commentary row of the rubric. Connections across units. This concept threads through the entire course. In Unit 4, when you examine claims and evidence, think about how the speaker's credibility affects whether evidence lands. In Unit 6 on argumentation, the speaker's constructed ethos is foundational to whether an argument persuades. And when you get to synthesis tasks, you'll often be asked to consider how multiple speakers with different perspectives contribute to a conversation, which means understanding each speaker's persona, purpose, and constructed authority. The speaker is never background noise in a text. The speaker is the text's voice, its face, its handshake with the reader. And once you start reading every passage asking who is this speaker performing themselves to be and why, you'll find the analysis practically writes itself. Up next, we'll look at how the audience functions in the rhetorical situation, and you'll see just how dynamically the speaker and audience construct each other in a kind of ongoing rhetorical conversation. 2.9 Identifying genre and its influence on rhetorical choices. What genre actually means and why you already know more than you think. Let's start with something you already do every single day without thinking about it. When you get a text from your best friend, you don't read it the same way you read a permission slip from school. When you scroll past a sponsored post on Instagram, something in your brain immediately flags it differently than a news article. That mental shift, that automatic recalibration of expectations, is you responding to genre. You're already an expert at this. The AP exam just wants you to make that expertise conscious and precise. In AP Lang, genre refers to a category of writing defined by a shared set of conventions, the recurring formal features, structural patterns, stylistic tendencies, and social functions that readers and writers have agreed upon, often over centuries. Think of genre as a kind of contract between writer and audience. When a writer chooses a genre, they're making a promise. Here's roughly what kind of thing this is, roughly how it works, and roughly what you should expect to get out of it. And crucially, for the AP exam, that choice of genre shapes every other rhetorical decision the writer makes. The genre-rhetorical choice connection. Here's the key insight you need to lock in. Genre is not just a label you slap on a piece of writing after the fact. Genre actively constrains and enables rhetorical choices. Think of it like the rules of a game. A basketball court doesn't tell LeBron James exactly what to do, but it tells him what's possible. He can't suddenly start running bases. Similarly, a genre like the op-ed doesn't dictate every word a writer uses, but it creates a field of possibility. It tells the writer how long to be, how formal to sound, whether to use first person, how much evidence to include, and what emotional register is appropriate. College Board wants you to be able to identify a genre and then explain how that genre influenced specific rhetorical choices in the text. Choices about diction, syntax, structure, tone, evidence, and appeals. This is the analytical move that separates a 3 response from a 5 response on the FRQ. You can't just name the genre and move on. You have to trace the causal connection because this is a eulogy. The writer chooses elevated diction and second-person address. Because this is a satirical essay, the writer deploys irony where a policy report would use statistics. The genre shapes the choice serves the genre. Key genres you must know for the exam. The AP exam draws from a fairly consistent range of genres, and you should be able to identify each one on sight. The personal essay tends to be reflective and exploratory, written in first person, with a more associative structure that privileges the writer's emotional and intellectual journey over a linear argument. It earns its authority through authenticity rather than expertise. The op-ed or editorial makes a clear argumentative claim, usually within 800 words, aimed at a general public readership. Expect directness, strong opinions, and accessible language that avoids jargon. The speech, especially a commencement address or political speech, is built for the ear rather than the eye, which means you'll see more repetition, more rhetorical questions, more parallel structure, and stronger emotional appeals than you'd find in a written essay. You'll also encounter the letter, and letters vary enormously by subgenre. A letter to the editor and an open letter both address a public audience through an ostensibly private form, which creates a particular kind of intimacy at scale effect. Scientific or academic writing tends to deprioritize the writer's personal voice in favor of evidence and objectivity, using passive constructions and citation conventions that signal participation in a scholarly conversation. Satire, whether it takes the form of an essay, a letter, or even a fake advertisement, uses irony, exaggeration, and humor to critique, and recognizing this genre early is critical, because if you miss the satirical register, you'll fundamentally misread the text's purpose and end up choosing wrong answers all day long. The big MCQ trap: confusing genre with mode or purpose. Here's the trap that catches students most often on multiple choice: confusing genre with rhetorical mode or purpose. Genre is the category of the text, the form. Mode is the method of development: narration, description, argumentation, exposition. Purpose is what the writer is trying to do: persuade, inform, entertain, critique. These 3 things often travel together, which is exactly why they're easy to muddle. A eulogy genre might use narration mode to celebrate a life purpose, but if a question asks you what genre the passage exemplifies, to celebrate a life is not a genre answer. Don't let purpose masquerade as genre. Another common trap involves hybrid texts, passages that blend features of multiple genres. A personal essay might include reportorial research. A speech might embed a narrative. When you encounter these, the exam isn't asking you to force the text into a single box. Instead, recognize which genre conventions are dominant and explain how the blend itself creates a rhetorical effect. That nuanced answer is exactly what the FRQ rubric rewards. Connections to the broader rhetorical situation. Genre doesn't exist in isolation. It connects directly to every other element of the rhetorical situation you've been studying throughout Unit 2. The writer's purpose shapes which genre they choose, but conversely, once they've chosen a genre, that genre shapes how they can credibly pursue their purpose. The audience expects certain things from certain genres, and violating those expectations is itself a rhetorical choice, sometimes a powerful one, sometimes a disaster. The context and exigence determine which genres are available and appropriate. A press release, for instance, only makes sense in a context where there's an institutional voice responding to a public event. Strip away that context and the genre collapses. On FRQs, especially the rhetorical analysis essay, bringing in genre as an analytical lens elevates your argument significantly. Instead of just saying the author uses pathos, You can say, because this is a commencement address, a genre in which the speaker is expected to inspire and send off. The author's use of pathos is not merely emotional manipulation, but a fulfillment of generic convention, which itself lends the appeal additional credibility. That's the kind of layered, precise thinking that earns top scores. A quick diagnostic move for test day. When you encounter a passage on the AP exam, spend 5 seconds asking, what kind of thing is this? Where would I find it in the real world? Who wrote it? For whom and in what setting? Those answers will unlock genre, and genre will unlock everything else about the passage, the diction choices, the structural moves, the appeals, the tone. Think of genre identification as the master key that opens the room where all the other rhetorical choices live. With that foundation in place, you're ready to zoom in on one of the most powerful tools any writer uses within their chosen genre. The art of reading and responding to your audience, which is exactly where we're headed next. 2.10 Analyzing how subject matter shapes rhetoric. Let's talk about something that might seem obvious at first, but turns out to be one of the most nuanced concepts on the AP Lang exam. The idea that what a writer is writing about fundamentally shapes how they write about it. This is the heart of section 2.10, and once you internalize it, you'll start reading every text differently, like a mechanic who can't stop noticing engines everywhere they go. The core idea, subject matter as a rhetorical force. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a friend helping 2 different people write something important. One friend needs to write a condolence card after a loss. The other needs to write a complaint letter to their landlord about a broken furnace. Even before you sit down to write, the subject matter itself is already making decisions for you. It's pulling certain words forward, pushing others back, demanding a particular tone, a particular structure, a particular relationship with the reader. You don't get to write the condolence card with the aggressive urgency of the landlord letter, and you don't get to write the landlord letter with the soft, grieving cadence of consolation. The subject is bossing you around, and good writers know it. In AP Lang terms, this concept lives inside the broader framework of the rhetorical situation. You already know the elements: speaker, audience, purpose, context, and exigence. Subject matter is what the text is actually about, and it operates as a kind of gravitational field that bends all those other elements toward it. The College Board wants you to analyze not just what rhetorical choices a writer makes, but why the subject itself made certain choices necessary or appropriate. How subject matter constrains and enables choices. Here's where it gets interesting. Subject matter works in 2 directions simultaneously. It constrains some choices and enables others. A writer addressing the technical complexity of climate science is constrained. They probably cannot use loose, casual slang without losing credibility, because the subject carries a weight of evidence and expertise that demands precise language. But that same subject enables something too. It opens the door to data, statistics, expert testimony, and the kind of logical appeals, logos, that feel out of place in, say, a personal eulogy. On the flip side, a writer addressing personal grief is constrained away from cold statistics and clinical distance, but enabled to use intimate anecdote, lyrical prose, and emotional appeal, pathos, in ways that would feel manipulative or inappropriate in a scientific report. The subject matter licenses certain moves and revokes others. This is exactly the kind of analysis the AP exam rewards. When you encounter an FRQ prompt asking you to analyze rhetorical choices, one of your most powerful analytical moves is to connect a specific choice, word choice, structure, tone, use of evidence, back to what the subject demands. Examiners are looking for that causal link, not just what the writer does, but why that subject makes that choice effective or necessary. The complexity spectrum: simple, controversial, and abstract subjects. Different categories of subject matter produce predictably different rhetorical patterns, and recognizing these patterns will help you both in the multiple choice section and in your FRQ analysis. When a subject is relatively concrete and uncontested, say a set of instructions for assembling furniture, the rhetoric tends to be direct, sequentially organized, and stripped of ornamentation. There's no need to build ethos elaborately or to seduce the reader emotionally. The subject simply needs to be conveyed clearly, but when a subject is controversial, gun legislation, immigration policy, abortion rights, the rhetorical situation transforms dramatically. Now the writer must anticipate opposition, manage their own credibility carefully, and navigate an audience that may be hostile. The subject's controversial nature essentially forces the writer to work harder across all appeals. Ethos must be established carefully because the reader's trust is not automatic. Logos must be airtight because opponents will exploit any gap, and pathos must be deployed strategically rather than broadly, because an audience already primed for disagreement will resist obvious emotional manipulation. Abstract subjects present their own challenge. When a writer tackles something like justice, freedom, or beauty, they face the rhetorical problem of making the intangible tangible. Watch for writers who anchor abstract subjects in concrete examples or anecdotes. That move is almost always a response to what the subject demands. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail is a masterclass in this. The abstract subject of moral justice is constantly grounded in specific, visceral images, the face of a daughter who cannot go to a public amusement park, the word wait ringing with the piercing familiarity of something said too long. The subject's abstraction drove those choices. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring considerations. The most common trap on multiple-choice questions in this area is confusing subject matter with purpose. They're related but distinct. Purpose is what the writer wants to achieve, to persuade, to inform, to commemorate. Subject matter is the terrain they're working in. A writer's purpose might be to persuade, but it's the subject, say a traumatic historical event, that determines whether they lean on emotional testimony or historical evidence to achieve that persuasion. When an MCQ asks why a writer uses a particular strategy, an answer rooted in subject matter, because the topic is inherently emotionally charged, requiring pathos to be effective, is more analytically precise than one rooted only in purpose, because the writer wants to persuade. For FRQ scoring, the College Board's rubrics reward what they call sophistication at the highest scoring levels. And one reliable path to that sophistication point is demonstrating how subject matter itself becomes a shaping force on rhetorical choices. Don't just catalog what the writer does, argue why the subject made those choices almost inevitable, or explain what it would cost the writer rhetorically to ignore what the subject demands. Connections across units. This concept threads beautifully into Unit 4. Where you'll analyze how writers make arguments, because the kinds of evidence and reasoning available to a writer are directly constrained by subject matter. It also connects back to Unit 1's foundational idea that every text is a constructed artifact shaped by context. And when you reach Unit 5 on style, you'll see that even sentence-level decisions, syntax, diction, tone, are downstream consequences of what the subject requires. Understanding how subject matter shapes rhetoric is really about developing a holistic, integrated way of reading, seeing the text not as a collection of independent choices, but as a coherent response to the demands of a particular subject in a particular world, and that's the kind of reading that earns top scores. Coming up next, we'll move into Unit 3, where we take everything we've learned about the rhetorical situation and start examining how the claims and evidence a writer selects are themselves rhetorical acts. 211 occasion and its effect on a text. Let's talk about something that changes everything, not just in writing, but in life. Imagine you're at a funeral, and someone walks up to the podium and delivers what sounds like a stand-up comedy routine. Or picture a comedian on stage who suddenly stops cracking jokes and starts reading a somber elegy. Something feels wrong, doesn't it? That wrongness you're sensing, that's your gut understanding of occasion, and it's one of the most powerful forces shaping any piece of writing or speech. What occasion actually means on the AP exam, College Board uses the word occasion very precisely, so let's nail it down. Occasion refers to the specific moment in time, the immediate event, circumstance, or situation that prompted a writer or speaker to create a text. Think of it this way. If rhetoric is a house, occasion is the spark that made someone decide to build it in the first place. It's not just the general topic or subject matter. It's the why now, the triggering event that made communication feel urgent, necessary, or appropriate. Here's an analogy that might stick with you. Occasion is like the weather that makes you grab an umbrella. The umbrella is the text itself, the speech, the essay, the letter, the op-ed. The weather is the occasion. Without the storm, you never reach for the umbrella. Without the occasion, the text doesn't exist. Abraham Lincoln didn't just wake up one morning and think, "I feel like giving a speech about sacrifice." He stood at Gettysburg 4 months after one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, dedicating a military cemetery. That battlefield, that fresh grief, those 51,000 casualties, that was the occasion, and it shaped every single word of his address. The 2 layers of occasion, here's something the AP exam loves to test, and something students frequently blur together. Occasion actually has 2 layers, and you need to be able to distinguish them. The first is the immediate occasion, the specific event or circumstance that directly triggered the text. This might be a legislative vote, a natural disaster, a death, a graduation, or a court decision. For Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, the immediate occasion was a published statement from 8 white Alabama clergymen criticizing the civil rights demonstrations. The second layer is the broader cultural or historical context that surrounds that immediate trigger. This is sometimes called the larger exigence, the ongoing social conditions, values, tensions, and conversations that made the immediate occasion resonate the way it did. For King's letter, the broader context included a century of institutionalized racism, the ongoing civil rights movement, and a nation wrestling with its own declared values of freedom and equality. The immediate occasion got King writing. The broader context determined what the writing meant and why it mattered beyond that Birmingham jail cell. When you see a multiple-choice question asking about occasion, read carefully. Are they asking you to identify the immediate trigger or the larger social context? These are not the same thing, and picking the wrong one is the most common trap on occasion-related questions. How occasion shapes rhetorical choices. Now here's where it gets really interesting for the exam. Because occasion doesn't just explain why a text exists, it explains why the text sounds the way it does. A writer's awareness of occasion drives nearly every major rhetorical decision. Tone, diction, structure, evidence, even length. Think about eulogies for a moment. A eulogy delivered at a funeral for a beloved grandmother uses intimate personal anecdotes, a gentle and reverent tone, and concrete sensory details that help mourners feel close to someone they've lost. But a eulogy delivered at a state funeral, say for a president or national hero, tends toward the grand and universal, speaking about legacy and national identity rather than personal memories. Same genre, completely different rhetorical execution. Why? Because the occasion differs. The audience, the setting, the stakes, the relationship between speaker and listener, all of this changes when the occasion changes. On your AP exam FRQs, especially the rhetorical analysis essay, this is a crucial move. When you explain why a writer makes a particular choice, you can often anchor that explanation in occasion. Don't just say Lincoln uses an emotional tone. Say, given the occasion, a ceremony to consecrate a burial ground for fallen soldiers, Lincoln adopts a tone of solemn reverence because his audience of grieving families and veterans needed both comfort and a sense of meaning. That's the kind of analysis that earns scoring rubric credit in the sophistication and evidence commentary columns. Occasion versus purpose versus context. Don't confuse them. The AP exam will also test your ability to distinguish occasion from other elements of the rhetorical situation, particularly purpose and context. Here's how to keep them separate. Purpose is what the writer wants to accomplish, to persuade, inform, critique, commemorate. Context is the broader environment in which communication occurs, historical period, cultural values, power, dynamics. Occasion is the specific catalyst, the moment that said, "The time is now." A helpful way to think about it: context is the river, occasion is the rock that disrupts the current, and purpose is where the speaker wants the water to flow. They're related, they influence each other, but they are distinct concepts with distinct AP exam definitions. Occasion in the MCQ and FRQ sections. In the multiple choice section, occasion questions often ask you to identify what prompted a text. or to explain how a specific occasion shapes a rhetorical choice within a passage. Watch for answer choices that describe context or purpose, and try to pass themselves off as occasion. The College Board loves this trap. Always ask yourself, is this the triggering event, or is this a broader condition or a desired outcome? In the free response section, especially the rhetorical analysis prompt, you'll almost never be asked to define occasion in isolation. Instead, you'll be expected to use your understanding of occasion as one analytical lens among several. The highest-scoring essays weave occasion into their analysis, naturally, connecting it to why the writer makes specific stylistic or argumentative choices and explaining how the moment in time shaped the meaning of the text. Connecting to the bigger picture, occasion connects deeply to every other element of the rhetorical situation you've been studying in Unit 2, speaker, audience, purpose, context, and exigence. In fact, occasion is essentially the most immediate expression of exigence, the specific circumstance that makes communication not just possible, but necessary. As you move forward into studying claims, evidence, and argumentation in later units, you'll find that occasion quietly underlies those concepts too, because a persuasive argument only makes sense when you understand the moment it was built for. Up next, you'll explore how writers use evidence and commentary to build their arguments, and just like occasion shapes the why of a text, the choices writers make about evidence shape the how. 2.12 Analyzing how multiple rhetorical situations interact. Let's talk about something that separates the students who score a 3 from the students who score a 5, the ability to see that texts don't exist in isolation. Every piece of writing you'll encounter on the AP exam, every speech, essay, letter, or editorial is in conversation with other texts, other moments, other audiences. That's what this section is really about. Think of it like this. If a single rhetorical situation is one instrument playing a melody, then multiple rhetorical situations interacting is an entire orchestra, and your job is to hear how those instruments are playing off each other. What multiple rhetorical situations actually means, you already know the basic components of a rhetorical situation: the speaker or writer, the audience, the purpose, the subject, and the context. But here's where things get more sophisticated. Real-world texts rarely respond to just one rhetorical situation. They respond to an entire web of them. A president's speech at a memorial isn't just about the people in that room. It's responding to a national mood, invoking speeches given decades earlier, anticipating how critics will react tomorrow, and speaking to a historical record that will outlast every living listener. That's multiple rhetorical situations layering on top of each other simultaneously. The College Board wants you to recognize this layering and analyze how it shapes the choices a writer or speaker makes. When one rhetorical situation influences another, the technical term the AP course uses is rhetorical interaction. You're looking at how the demands of one communicative context push, pull, or reshape the demands of another. The 3 most common interaction patterns. Think of these as the 3 main ways texts talk to each other and to their surrounding contexts. The first is response, when a text is directly addressing or reacting to a previous text or event. Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," is a brilliant example. The rhetorical situation of the holiday, patriotic celebration, national pride, a mostly white abolitionist audience, creates one set of expectations. Douglass's purpose and the rhetorical situation he brings to that moment, a formerly enslaved man speaking about American freedom, creates an entirely different one. The 2 situations collide, and that collision is the source of the speech's power. On the exam, you might be asked why Douglass makes certain word choices or structural decisions. The answer often lives at that intersection. The second pattern is anticipation, when a writer shapes their text based on a rhetorical situation that hasn't happened yet but that they are already accounting for. Think of a scientist writing a paper that will be peer-reviewed by skeptics, or a politician crafting remarks that they know will be quoted out of context. The anticipated future audience creates a second rhetorical situation that operates alongside the immediate one. Writers hedge, qualify, preemptively address objections, or choose diction carefully because they're writing for two audiences at once, the one in the room and the one they imagine reading the transcript tomorrow. The third pattern is embedded situations, where one text quotes, references, or incorporates another. When an op-ed quotes an expert, that quoted voice brings its own rhetorical situation into the essay. The original context of that quote, who said it, why, for whom, bleeds into the new context. This is why AP readers will ask you to analyze not just what a text says, but how it uses other texts, voices, or moments. How this shows up on the exam in multiple-choice questions, this concept most commonly appears as questions asking you to explain why a writer makes a particular structural or tonal shift. The trap answer almost always points to just one rhetorical situation, one audience, one purpose. The correct answer typically acknowledges the complexity, that the writer is balancing or navigating two competing rhetorical demands at the same time. Watch for questions that include phrases like, in the context of, or given the circumstances. Those are signals that the question is asking you to think about how context layers. For free response questions, especially the synthesis essay, question 1, and the rhetorical analysis essay, question 2, this concept is absolutely central. In the synthesis essay, you are literally constructing an argument from multiple sources, each of which has its own rhetorical situation. A student who simply summarizes each source earns limited points. A student who recognizes that source C is responding to the same cultural moment as source A, but from a different speaker position with a different audience, and then uses that relationship to build their own argument, that student earns the higher scoring tier. The AP rubric uses the word sophistication, and this kind of multi-situational thinking is one of the clearest paths to that sophistication point. In the rhetorical analysis essay, avoid the trap of treating the text as if it were written in a vacuum. A common scoring mistake is analyzing only the internal features of the text, the metaphors, the syntax, without grounding those choices in how the speaker was navigating competing contextual pressures. If you're analyzing Lincoln's second inaugural address, for instance, you need to engage with the fact that Lincoln was speaking to a war-weary nation, anticipating a hostile Reconstruction political landscape, and also placing himself within a long tradition of American political rhetoric that invokes providence. Those are three distinct rhetorical situations, and his word choices can't be fully explained without seeing how he's managing all three. A mental model to keep handy. Here's an analogy that should stick with you. Imagine you're texting a friend about a conflict with your parent, but your other parent is right across the room. You're writing for two audiences simultaneously. Your style, word choice, and what you include or leave out are all shaped by that double rhetorical situation. That exact dynamic operates in virtually every sophisticated public text you'll analyze on this exam. Ask yourself, who else beyond the obvious audience is this writer aware of? What prior text or event is this responding to? What future moment or audience is the writer already accounting for? Each of those questions reveals a different rhetorical situation that is interacting with the primary one. Connections to other units. This concept doesn't disappear after Unit 2. It threads through the entire course. In Unit 4, when you study how writers make arguments, you'll find that the strongest arguments acknowledge counter-arguments, which is really just the writer accounting for an adversarial rhetorical situation. In Unit 5, when you analyze style and structure, you'll see that shifts in tone or register often signal that the writer is pivoting from one rhetorical situation to another. And in Unit 9, when you write your own arguments, your ability to anticipate your reader's objections and situate your claim within a larger conversation depends entirely on your fluency with this concept. Mastering rhetorical interaction is really mastering awareness, the ability to see that every act of communication is happening against a backdrop of other communications, and that the best writers are always in dialogue with that backdrop. Speaking of dialogue, that idea of how writers position themselves within a larger conversation leads us perfectly into our next topic: how writers establish and use claims and evidence to do the work of persuasion across all of those layered rhetorical situations. 2.13 Rhetorical Triangle. Relationships among speaker, audience, and subject. The big picture, a triangle built for communication. Imagine you're at a dinner party and you're trying to convince your skeptical uncle that climate change is real. You'd probably talk differently to him than you would to a room full of environmental scientists. And differently again if you were writing an op-ed for a national newspaper. What's changing in each of those situations isn't the underlying science. What's changing is the relationship between you, your audience, and your subject. That dynamic relationship is exactly what the rhetorical triangle captures, and it is one of the most foundational frameworks in all of AP language and composition. The rhetorical triangle, sometimes called the Aristotelian triangle, because it traces back to Aristotle's rhetoric positions, three elements in relationship with one another: the speaker or writer, the audience, and the subject or message/topic. Each point of the triangle influences and is influenced by the other two. This isn't just a diagram to memorize, it's a living, breathing framework that explains why every rhetorical decision a writer makes is, at its core, a negotiation among these three forces. On the AP exam, you will be asked to analyze how real writers navigate exactly this negotiation, and your ability to discuss all three corners simultaneously, not just one in isolation, is what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. Defining the three corners. Start with the speaker. In AP Lang, College Board uses the term speaker to refer to the person or persona crafting the rhetorical act, not necessarily the biological author, but the voice constructed within the text. This is a critical distinction. When Frederick Douglass writes a 4th of July speech, the speaker is a formerly enslaved man addressing a white abolitionist audience, and that identity carries enormous rhetorical weight. The speaker brings ethos to the triangle. Their credibility, their character, their relationship to the subject, and the persona they choose to project. Always ask yourself, who is speaking, what authority do they claim, and how does that positioning shape every choice in the text? Next comes the audience. The audience is never a passive recipient. They are active participants in the rhetorical transaction. The College Board expects you to analyze the intended audience, who the speaker is trying to reach, versus the actual audience who might actually read or hear the text, and sometimes those groups differ significantly. When Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, his immediate audience was the crowd at the dedication ceremony, but his intended audience stretched across a divided nation and arguably into history itself. The audience's values, prior knowledge, emotional state, and relationship to the speaker all shape what rhetorical strategies will work. This is where pathos lives, the emotional appeals. A speaker calibrates specifically for this audience in this moment. The third corner is the subject, the actual content, topic, or claim being communicated. The subject interacts with both the speaker and audience in ways that constrain rhetorical choices. A complex scientific topic demands different handling than a personal narrative. A controversial subject requires more careful audience management than a benign one. The subject is also where logos enters the triangle, the logical structure, evidence, and reasoning that give the message intellectual substance. Think of the subject as the cargo being carried across a bridge. The bridge itself is built differently depending on how heavy the load is and who's waiting on the other side. How the relationships work together. Here is the key insight College Board wants you to demonstrate on the exam. No corner of the triangle operates independently. Change one element, and the others must respond. This is what the word relationships in the skill name means, and it's the conceptual heart of 2.13. Consider a doctor explaining a cancer diagnosis. When speaking to the patient, she might use plain language, lean heavily on compassionate tone, and frame information around hope and action. When writing in a medical journal, she uses technical terminology, prioritizes precision of data, and assumes a highly trained audience. The subject is the same diagnosis, but the speaker's relationship to that subject and to her audience shifts completely between contexts, and so does every rhetorical strategy she deploys. That's the triangle at work. On free response questions, you must show the examiner that you understand these relationships are mutual and dynamic. It's not enough to say the speaker uses pathos. You need to say something like, by drawing on personal grief, the speaker, writing as a grieving parent rather than a policy expert, creates a point of shared emotional experience that bridges the distance between herself and an audience that might otherwise resist her political argument. That sentence shows speaker-to-audience relationship, speaker's relationship to subject, and the strategic intent behind a rhetorical choice. That's a scoring, rubric-worthy analysis. Common exam traps and how to avoid them. The most common trap students fall into on multiple-choice questions is analyzing the three corners of the triangle in isolation rather than in relationship. A question might ask you to identify how the speaker's position affects the rhetorical choices made, and a student who only identifies the speaker's background without explaining how it connects to audience or subject will miss the deeper analytical point the question is testing. Another frequent mistake is conflating the author with the speaker. On the exam, always default to analyzing the constructed speaker, the voice within the text, unless you have explicit contextual information about the author's biography. Similarly, students often mistake the subject for simply the topic. The subject includes the claim, the framing of that claim, and the way the speaker positions the content for the specific audience. It's not just what is said, it's how the content is shaped by the other two corners of the triangle. Connections to the rest of the course. The rhetorical triangle doesn't live in isolation within the course. It's the scaffolding under nearly everything else in AP Lang. When you study appeals, ethos, pathos, logos in Unit 2, you're essentially learning the tools each corner of the triangle contributes. When you analyze rhetorical situation more broadly, exigence, purpose, context in skills 2.1 through 2.12, you're building the contextual frame that the triangle then operates within. In Unit 3, when you examine line of reasoning and evidence, you're examining how the subject corner gets constructed. And in your own writing across Units 7 and 8, you are constantly adjusting your own triangle, deciding who you are as a speaker, who your audience is, and how to frame your subject accordingly. The rhetorical triangle is also closely tied to the concept of kairos, the idea of timeliness and appropriateness. The right message, from the right speaker to the right audience, delivered at exactly the right moment. That's the full rhetorical situation, and the triangle is the framework you use to analyze whether all three corners are aligned. Now that you understand how speakers, audiences, and subjects shape one another in the rhetorical triangle, we're ready to zoom in on one of the most powerful tools a speaker uses to position themselves within that triangle, and that's the careful crafting of ethos, where we'll explore exactly how writers build, borrow, and sometimes lose credibility on the page. 2.14 Applying Rhetorical Situation Analysis to the Synthesis FRQ. What the synthesis FRQ actually is, let's start with the big picture, because a lot of students walk into the AP exam thinking the synthesis FRQ is just a research paper in disguise, and that misunderstanding costs them serious points. Here's the better way to think about it. Imagine you've been hired as a consultant, and your client has given you 6 or 7 documents on a topic, news articles, charts, op-eds, personal essays, maybe a photograph or advertisement. Your job is not to summarize those documents. Your job is to stake out a position on a debatable question and then use those sources as evidence to defend your argument. The synthesis FRQ is fundamentally a persuasive writing task, and everything about how you approach it should flow from that understanding. Now, where does rhetorical situation analysis come in? Right at the very beginning, before you write a single sentence of your response. The College Board's own course framework describes the rhetorical situation as the complex of elements that surround any act of communication, the exigence, the problem or opportunity that prompts the writing, the writer, the audience, the purpose, the context, and the message itself. In Section 2.14, you're learning to apply that analytical framework strategically, not just to text you're reading, but to the text you're writing. This is a crucial distinction that separates a 3-level response from a 5-level response. Reading the prompt as a rhetorical situation, think of the synthesis FRQ prompt the way a theater director reads a script. Before rehearsal begins, the director asks, "What's the situation here? Who is speaking, to whom, and why?" You need to ask the same questions when you read your prompt. The exigence is almost always built right into the prompt's framing. When the College Board writes something like, "Over the past decade, debate has intensified over whether standardized testing should be abolished," they are handing you the exigence on a silver platter. Something has created urgency around this issue. There's a reason this conversation is happening now in this form. Good writers don't ignore that urgency. They lean into it. When your introduction acknowledges the stakes of the debate, you immediately signal to your reader that you understand why this matters, which is the hallmark of rhetorical awareness. The audience in the synthesis FRQ is somewhat implied. You're writing to an educated general audience that is familiar with the topic but hasn't necessarily formed a firm opinion. Think of your reader as a thoughtful, skeptical friend who will push back if your argument is vague or unsupported. This imagined audience should shape your tone. You want to be authoritative without being condescending, confident without being dismissive of counter-arguments. Purpose is your compass. Here is one of the most common traps on the AP exam, and I want you to hear this clearly. Students frequently confuse having a thesis with having a purpose. Your thesis tells the reader what you believe. Your purpose tells you why you're writing and what you want to accomplish for your audience. These are related but not identical, and conflating them leads to essays that feel aimless even when they have a clear argument. Your purpose in the synthesis FRQ is persuasion. Specifically, you want to change or solidify your reader's perspective on the issue. Every rhetorical choice you make, from how you sequence your sources to which counter-arguments you acknowledge, should be aimed at achieving that purpose. When you're deciding whether to open with a dramatic anecdote drawn from one of the sources or a surprising statistical claim from another, the question to ask is, which opening better serves my persuasive purpose with this audience? Rhetorical situation analysis gives you the framework to answer that question rather than just guessing. Using sources as rhetorical actors, not decorations. Now let's talk about how rhetorical situation awareness changes the way you actually use your sources, because this is where points are won and lost. The scoring rubric for the synthesis FRQ requires that you use evidence from at least 3 sources and that you explain how the evidence supports your argument, not just quote or paraphrase. The College Board's language here is precise. You must explain the relationship between the evidence and your claim. Students who earn the top scores treat sources as rhetorical actors with their own credibility, purpose, and context. What does that look like in practice? Suppose one of your sources is an op-ed written by a teacher arguing against standardized testing. A surface-level student just quotes the teacher and moves on. A rhetorically aware student notes that this source's credibility comes from professional experience. The teacher has first-hand knowledge of how these tests affect classroom instruction and then explains how that ethos strengthens the specific claim being made. You're essentially doing a mini rhetorical situation analysis on each source as you deploy it, asking who wrote this, for whom, toward what purpose, and how does that context make this evidence more or less persuasive in my argument? This connects directly to the skills you practiced in earlier sections of Unit 2, particularly when you analyzed how audience and purpose shape a writer's choices. The synthesis task is asking you to produce what you've been analyzing all semester. Context, complexity, and the sophistication point. The AP rubric awards a sophistication point to essays that demonstrate a complex understanding of the topic. One reliable path to that point is through contextual thinking, and this is where your rhetorical situation framework becomes a genuinely powerful tool. Sophisticated writers situate their argument within a larger context, historical precedent, competing value systems, or the limitations of the available evidence itself. When you acknowledge that the debate over standardized testing isn't just about pedagogy, but about equity access and the politics of measurement, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of contextual awareness the rubric rewards. A common wrong answer trap in this area is what I call sophistication cosplay, using complex-sounding language without actually deepening the argument. Saying, "This issue is multifaceted," is not sophistication. Explaining how 2 seemingly compatible values actually create genuine tension is. The rhetorical situation framework helps you avoid this trap because it naturally pushes you to think about competing audiences, conflicting purposes, and the cultural context that makes a given issue controversial in the first place. Connecting to the broader course. Everything you're applying in 2.14 draws on the full vocabulary of Unit 2, exigence, audience, purpose, context, and the relationships among them, and it also anticipates the work of Unit 4, where you'll dig deeper into how writers structure arguments and deploy evidence. Think of this section as the bridge between reading rhetorically and writing rhetorically. The synthesis FRQ is where your analytical skills become compositional ones. As we move forward, you'll see how the specific strategies for building arguments, particularly how to arrange and qualify claims, give you even more precise tools for turning that rhetorical situation awareness into a genuinely compelling, high-scoring essay. 215. Applying rhetorical situation analysis to the rhetorical analysis FRQ. The big picture, what this section is really about. Imagine you've spent weeks learning all the ingredients in a master chef's pantry. You know what rhetorical situation is? You understand purpose and audience and context. You can name exigence without hesitating. Now, in section 215, we're finally walking into the kitchen and cooking. This section is where everything you've learned about rhetorical situations stops being vocabulary and starts becoming a scoring strategy. The rhetorical analysis FRQ, that's free response question number 1 on your AP exam, is essentially a rhetorical situation analysis with a thesis and evidence attached. If you can master this connection, you're already most of the way to a high score. Here's the core truth you need to internalize. The College Board does not want you to simply identify rhetorical devices the way a birdwatcher catalogs species. They want you to explain how those choices function within a specific rhetorical situation. That distinction is the difference between a score of 3 and a score of 6. Understanding the rhetorical situation framework in the FRQ context. Let's refresh the framework quickly and then see how it maps directly onto the essay prompt. The rhetorical situation, as College Board defines it, consists of the speaker or writer, the audience, the purpose, the subject, and the context, including the occasion, setting, and broader cultural or historical moment. You've seen these terms before, but now, when you open your exam booklet and read a passage followed by a prompt asking you to analyze the rhetorical choices a writer makes, every single one of those elements becomes a lens you need to use. Think of it like this. When you analyze a text rhetorically, you're essentially asking, who is speaking to whom about what, for what purpose, and under what circumstances? And then, here's the critical move. You're asking how specific choices in the text reflect, respond to, or shape those conditions. The rhetorical situation isn't background noise. It's the stage the argument is built on, and every word choice, structural decision, and tonal shift is an act of performing for that specific stage. The thesis and the rhetorical situation. Your thesis in the rhetorical analysis FRQ must make a defensible claim about how rhetorical choices work together to achieve a purpose. Notice that phrase, rhetorical choices work together to achieve a purpose. Purpose is the heartbeat of the rhetorical situation, and your thesis needs to be beating in time with it. A weak thesis says the author uses pathos, logos, and ethos. A strong thesis says by grounding her emotional appeals in documented personal testimony and addressing a skeptical, politically moderate audience directly. The author builds credibility while dismantling the audience's potential resistance. See the difference? The second thesis already maps the choices to the rhetorical situation. It names the audience and explains how choices respond to that audience's characteristics. The most common trap students fall into on the FRQ is writing a thesis that identifies devices without connecting them to situational context. College Board's rubric rewards what they call a line of reasoning. That means your argument needs a spine, and that spine is the rhetorical situation. Every body paragraph should be a new link in a chain that runs from here is a rhetorical choice to here is how it functions to here is why it matters given this specific speaker, audience, and moment. Evidence and commentary, where rhetorical situation does the heavy lifting. When you cite evidence from the passage, a metaphor, a shift in tone, a direct address to the reader, your commentary cannot just describe what you see. It must explain why that choice makes sense given the rhetorical situation. This is where students most often lose points. They'll quote a powerful anecdote the author uses and say, "This uses pathos to make readers feel emotional." That's description. Commentary that earns points sounds more like, by anchoring this statistic inside a grieving mother's first-hand account, the author bridges the gap between data-resistant readers and the policy argument, using the mother's credibility as a stand-in for the author's own authority in an emotional moment where pure logic would alienate rather than persuade. Every time you write about a rhetorical choice, ask yourself, why did this choice make sense for this particular audience at this particular moment, given this particular speaker's position? That question forces you to engage the rhetorical situation directly, and engagement with the rhetorical situation is exactly what the rubric rewards. Context and exigence, the edge cases students often miss. Here's an edge case that shows up frequently and catches students off guard. Sometimes the rhetorical situation itself is contested or complex within the passage. The speaker might be addressing multiple audiences simultaneously, say, a politician speaking at a commencement address that will be nationally televised. The immediate audience is the graduates, but the broader audience is voters watching at home. Strong analysis acknowledges this layered situation and explains how the rhetorical choices navigate both audiences at once. Missing this layering is a trap. If the passage has clear signals that the audience is more than one group, your analysis needs to reflect that complexity. Similarly, exigence, that urgent problem or gap that called the text into existence, isn't always spelled out explicitly. Sometimes you have to infer it from contextual clues in the passage or the prompt's preamble. College Board usually provides a brief setup paragraph before the passage. Read it carefully. That setup is telling you the rhetorical situation before you even begin reading the text itself. Students who skim that preamble are throwing away free points. Connections across units. This section connects deeply to everything you've done in Unit 1 on claims and evidence, because once you understand that every rhetorical choice is in dialogue with the rhetorical situation, your evidence analysis becomes purposeful rather than mechanical. It also connects forward to Unit 3, where you'll examine how writers position themselves through persona and tone, both of which are responses to the speaker-audience dynamic at the heart of rhetorical situation. When you get to the synthesis FRQ later, you'll be building your own rhetorical situation from scratch, which means understanding how situation shapes choices will help you make better choices as a writer, not just a reader. The quick mental checklist before you write a single word of your FRQ response. Pause for 30 seconds and map the rhetorical situation on your scratch paper. Write down, who is speaking and what is their position or stake? Who is the intended audience and what do they already believe or resist? What is the specific moment or occasion? And what is the exigence, the urgent need this text is responding to? That 30-second investment will organize every paragraph you write and keep your analysis from drifting into generic device spotting. Treat the rhetorical situation as your compass, not your conclusion. With this foundation in place, you're ready to zoom in even further. Next, we'll look at how to analyze the specific choices writers make to construct their arguments, building toward the kind of multi-layered reasoning that separates good analysis from truly excellent analysis on the AP exam. 2.16. Applying rhetorical situation analysis to the argument FRQ. Let's talk about one of the most powerful moves you can make on the AP English language exam, and honestly, one that too many students completely miss. You've spent time learning the components of the rhetorical situation: exigence, audience, purpose, context, writer, and message. You know them as abstract terms. But on the argument FRQ, the third free response question on your exam, those terms become your actual toolkit. They stop being vocabulary and start being a strategy. That's what this section is about. What the argument FRQ actually asks. First, let's be precise about what you're walking into. The argument FRQ gives you a short prompt, usually a quote or a brief statement, and asks you to construct your own argument in response. Unlike the synthesis FRQ, you're not weaving together provided sources. Unlike the rhetorical analysis FRQ, you're not analyzing someone else's choices. You are the writer. You are making the choices. And that distinction matters enormously. Because now the rhetorical situation isn't something you observe from the outside. It's something you inhabit from the inside. Think of it this way. In the rhetorical analysis FRQ, you're a film critic reviewing a director's choices. In the argument FRQ, you are the director. The rhetorical situation analysis you've practiced all unit is now your pre-production checklist before you start shooting. Exigence. Why this argument matters right now. Every strong argument begins with exigence, the urgent problem or gap that makes speaking necessary in the first place. Before you write a single sentence of your essay, you should be able to answer this question. What is the situation that makes this argument worth having? The AP exam prompt always contains an implied exigence, and your job is to surface it and build your response around it. Here's a common trap students fall into. They treat the argument FRQ like a generic 5-paragraph essay and ignore the specific urgency embedded in the prompt. They write about the topic in the abstract, rather than addressing why it matters here, now in the context the College Board is gesturing toward. When you acknowledge exigence in your opening, you signal to the reader and to the AP scorer that you understand argument as a situated act, not just an academic exercise. Audience awareness, the invisible third party in your essay. When you're writing the argument FRQ, your audience is technically the AP exam reader, but more importantly, you should be constructing a sense of implied audience within your essay. Ask yourself, who needs to be persuaded of this? What do they already believe? What values can you appeal to? What objections might they raise? This is where rhetorical situation analysis becomes a secret weapon. Most students write as if there is no one on the other end of the argument. They assert claims without anticipating pushback. But when you incorporate counter-argument and refutation, which the AP scoring rubric explicitly rewards, you are performing audience awareness on the page. You're saying, I know you might think X, and here's why my position still holds. That's not just good rhetoric, that's scoring points on the sophistication row of the rubric. Purpose, stance, and the thesis connection. Purpose in the rhetorical situation asks, what do you want your communication to accomplish? In an argument essay, your purpose is to persuade, but that's too vague to be useful. Sharpen it. Are you trying to change a belief, motivate an action, challenge an assumption, complicate an oversimplification? The answer to that question should be encoded in your thesis statement. The College Board's rubric awards a point for a defensible thesis, one that makes a specific claim that goes beyond restating the prompt. A weak thesis merely announces a topic. A strong thesis announces a purpose. Technology has both benefits and drawbacks is a topic restatement. Our cultural obsession with productivity has turned technology from a tool of liberation into an instrument of self-surveillance, is a thesis with purpose and stand. Notice how that second version implies an exigence, suggests an audience who might need convincing, and plants a flag in argumentative territory. Context and evidence where rhetorical situation meets support. Context in the rhetorical situation refers to the historical, cultural, and social circumstances surrounding an argument. When you bring evidence into your argument FRQ from history, literature, current events, personal experience, or science, you are drawing on context to make your case. The AP exam does not provide sources for this question, which means your evidence has to come from your own knowledge, and your ability to contextualize that evidence is what separates a 3 from a 5. Here's a practical move. When you introduce a piece of evidence, don't just describe it, situate it, explain the circumstances that make it relevant. A student who writes during the civil rights movement, activists used nonviolent protest, is reporting a fact. A student who writes, in a moment when legal channels had been systematically closed to Black Americans, the strategic nonviolence of the civil rights movement reframed the terms of the argument itself. Exposing the violence of the opposition rather than matching it is demonstrating contextual sophistication. The sophistication point and rhetorical complexity. Let's talk about that elusive sophistication point on the FRQ rubric, because rhetorical situation analysis is your clearest path to earning it. Sophistication is awarded when you demonstrate a nuanced understanding of the rhetorical situation, when you acknowledge complexity, tension, or alternative perspectives rather than flattening them. This might mean recognizing that your argument holds in some contexts but not others, that a counter-argument reveals a genuine tension you don't fully resolve, or that the values at stake in the argument are legitimately competing. This is not weakness, it's intellectual maturity, and it's exactly what the top of the rubric looks for. Connecting this to the full course. Everything you've learned in Unit 2, exigence, audience, purpose, context, writer, message, flows directly into the argument FRQ, but it also connects forward. In Unit 3, when you examine claims and evidence, you'll be building the argumentative architecture that sits inside the rhetorical frame you construct here. In Unit 4, when you study line of reasoning, you're learning how to make the progression of your argument feel inevitable rather than arbitrary. Rhetorical situation analysis is the foundation that every other analytical and compositional skill stands on. When you sit down to write your argument FRQ, don't skip the pre-writing. Take 2 minutes to map the rhetorical situation. Who is the implied audience? What is the exigence? What is my specific purpose? And what context am I drawing from? 2 minutes of rhetorical thinking before you write will save your essay from the most common failure mode on this question, which is a technically competent essay that argues about nothing in particular to no one in particular. Now that you understand how to inhabit the rhetorical situation as a writer, let's turn to the building blocks of what you're actually arguing, because in Unit 3 we're going to pull apart the anatomy of a claim and see exactly what makes evidence do persuasive work on the page. 2.17 Reading nonfiction prose passages through the lens of rhetorical situation. Here's a truth that separates students who score a 5 from students who score a 3. The difference usually isn't vocabulary, and it isn't even writing skill. It's the habit of reading every single passage through a specific lens, what we call the rhetorical situation. Think of this lens like a pair of glasses you never take off during the AP exam. Once you put them on, you stop reading passages as just a piece of writing, and start reading them as a sophisticated transaction between a writer, a purpose, an audience, and a moment in history. That shift in perspective changes everything. What is the rhetorical situation? The rhetorical situation is the constellation of circumstances that surrounds any piece of writing or speech. College Board expects you to understand it through 5 interconnected elements: the exigence, the writer or speaker, the audience, the purpose, and the context. Some teachers add a 6th element, the text or the message itself, and that framing is useful too. Each of these elements shapes every decision a writer makes, from word choice down to paragraph length. Your job on the AP exam is to move fluidly among these elements, rather than treating them as a checklist you run through once and forget. Exigence is the most misunderstood of the 5, so let's spend a moment on it. The word comes from the Latin exigere, meaning to demand or require. Exigence is the problem, event, or situation that motivates someone to write in the first place. It's the why now question. Imagine you're a doctor in 1906 who just read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. The exigence for writing your own letter to Congress isn't just that food is sometimes bad. It's the specific, urgent public outrage and health crisis that suddenly made action feel necessary and possible. Exigence is always tied to a moment. On the MCQ section, you'll often see questions that ask why an author opens a piece the way they do, or what is the author responding to. Those questions are almost always asking you to identify or analyze exigence, even if the word itself never appears. Breaking down each element. The writer element goes far beyond name and biography. When you analyze the writer, you're asking, what ethos does this person carry into the room before they write a single word? What experiences, credentials, or biases shape how they see the issue? Frederick Douglass writing about slavery carries different authority than a Northern abolitionist writing about slavery. Same topic, wildly different rhetorical positioning. The AP exam will frequently ask you to explain how a writer's background or perspective shapes their rhetorical choices, and they are an expert is never a complete answer. You need to connect the writer's position to specific choices in the text. Audience is where students most commonly stumble on FRQ scoring. Here's the trap. Students confuse who can read this with who is the intended audience. A speech delivered at a Senate hearing is technically available to anyone, but the intended audience is those senators. Your analysis must account for what that specific audience already believes, what they value, what might offend them, and what they need to be persuaded. When you write about audience in your essays, show how the text's specific choices, its vocabulary level, its use of statistics versus emotional appeals, its references to shared cultural knowledge, reveal who the writer was speaking to. That's what earns scoring points. Purpose is not just to persuade. College Board scoring guides consistently penalize vague purpose statements. A stronger framing is to persuade whom of what in order to achieve which outcome. Was the writer trying to move an audience to action? Or to shift a belief? Or to build solidarity among people who already agree? Each of those goals demands different strategies, and recognizing which goal is in play helps you explain why the rhetorical choices are the way they are. Context is the broadest element and the one that requires the most background knowledge. Context includes the historical moment, the cultural assumptions of the era, the genre conventions of the form, and even the publication venue. An essay published in The Atlantic in 1863 versus one published in a Southern newspaper in the same year operates in entirely different rhetorical contexts, even if the words on the page are identical. When the AP exam gives you a brief headnote at the top of a passage, and it almost always does, that headnote is your context gift. Do not skip it. Students who ignore headnotes routinely miss questions about audience and purpose because they lack the contextual anchor the headnote was designed to provide. How these elements work together. The most important thing to understand is that these 5 elements are not independent variables, they're an ecosystem. The exigence shapes who the audience needs to be. The audience shapes what purpose is even achievable. The context shapes what rhetorical strategies will work or fall flat. A great exam answer always traces these connections. Think of it like a recipe. You can identify all the ingredients individually, but understanding the dish means explaining how they interact. On both the MCQ and FRQ sections, you'll encounter passages that deliberately complicate one of these elements. A writer might address an audience with unexpected respect, treating potential adversaries as reasonable people, and that rhetorical choice has meaning only when you understand the full situation. Or a writer might adopt a tone that seems mismatched to the apparent purpose, and your job is to explain why that mismatch is actually strategic. These are the edge case questions that separate the high scorers. They're asking you not just to label the elements, but to explain the tension or interplay between them. Common exam traps and connection points. The most common wrong answer trap on MCQs about rhetorical situation is confusing subject with purpose and occasion with exigence. The subject is what the piece is about. The purpose is what the writer wants to accomplish. A piece can be about climate change subject, while its purpose is to restore confidence in scientific institutions, completely different. Exigence is not simply the event that happened. It's the urgency or problem that made writing necessary right now. Keep those distinctions crisp. This concept connects directly to Unit 1's work on claims and evidence, Unit 4's deep dive into appeals, logos, ethos, pathos, and Unit 8's argument synthesis, because every time you synthesize sources on the AP exam, you're essentially analyzing how different writers responded to the same or related rhetorical situations with different strategies. Rhetorical situation is the foundation. Everything else is built on top of it. Reading through this lens will also sharpen your analytical writing dramatically. Because instead of asking, what did the author say, you'll automatically be asking the richer question. Given this situation, why did the author say it this way to this audience at this moment? That's exactly the question the AP exam is designed to reward. Coming up next, we'll move into Unit 3 and start exploring how the claims a writer makes are structured and supported, and you'll see immediately how understanding rhetorical situation makes analyzing those claims feel much more intuitive. 218 Identifying rhetorical situation in MCQ passage-based questions. The lens before the rating. Imagine you've just received a text from a friend, and then immediately afterward a text from your boss, and then one more from your grandmother. Same phone, same screen, same you reading them, but the moment you see who sent each message, something shifts. You read them differently. You interpret the same phrase, say, "Can you come in this weekend?" with completely different expectations, assumptions, and emotional weight depending on who wrote it. That instinctive mental adjustment you make, that's rhetorical situation awareness, and on the AP language exam, it's one of the most heavily tested skills woven throughout the entire multiple-choice section. When you sit down with an MCQ passage, the College Board isn't just asking whether you understood the words. They're asking whether you understood why those words exist, who produced them, for whom, in what context, and toward what end. That framework has a formal name, the rhetorical situation. Mastering how to identify it quickly and precisely in MCQ passage-based questions is what separates a 3 from a 5. The 5 elements you must identify every time. The College Board organizes rhetorical situation around 5 core components, and you need to have them so internalized they feel automatic. The first is the speaker, or writer. Not just a name, but a constructed persona with a specific ethos, a set of values, a level of expertise, and a relationship to the subject matter. The second is the audience, the intended readers or listeners, whose values, knowledge base, and expectations the writer is consciously or unconsciously addressing. The third is the subject, what the text is actually about, at both the literal and thematic level. The fourth is the purpose, what the writer is trying to accomplish, which goes beyond broad categories like to persuade and get specific. To challenge a misconception, to motivate action, to commemorate, to critique, to reconcile. And the fifth, which students most commonly overlook, is the context, the historical moment, the publication venue, the cultural circumstances, and the occasion that called this piece of writing into existence. Some frameworks add exigence separately, the specific problem or need that prompted the writing. And while College Board often folds this into context and purpose, you should understand exigence as the why now, the urgent situation demanding a response. Reading the passage through a rhetorical lens. Here's where exam strategy gets concrete. When you encounter a passage in the MCQ section, your very first job before you even read question 1 is to absorb the header information. The College Board almost always provides a brief headnote or attribution line. Something like, "The following is an excerpt from a speech delivered by Frederick Douglass in 1852, or the following is adapted from a 2015 magazine article." That information is gold. It tells you about speaker, context, and often implied audience before you've read a single sentence. Students who skip that header and dive straight into the passage are missing a free gift from the exam writers. As you read, train yourself to ask continuously, who is this person in relation to this topic, and who are they talking to? A scientist writing in a peer-reviewed journal uses different vocabulary, assumes different background knowledge, and employs different appeals than the same scientist writing an op-ed for a general newspaper audience. If the MCQ asks you why the author uses a particular analogy or why they define a technical term mid-paragraph, the answer almost always lives in the audience. They're defining it because their readers aren't specialists. That's the rhetorical situation at work. The most common MCQ traps. The single most seductive wrong answer in rhetorical situation questions involves confusing the stated subject with the actual purpose. A speech might be ostensibly about a public park renovation, but actually functioning as a critique of city leadership. An essay might appear to be about beekeeping, but is really a meditation on community and interdependence. The College Board loves passages with this kind of layered intent, and wrong answers will describe only the surface subject while ignoring the deeper rhetorical purpose. When a question asks, what is the author's primary purpose, read past the literal topic and ask, what does the writer want the audience to feel, believe, or do by the end? Another trap involves misreading the audience. Students frequently assume the audience is everyone or the general public when the passage's vocabulary tone and assumed knowledge base clearly signal a specific group. If the passage uses technical jargon without definition, assumes familiarity with a historical event without explaining it, or adopts a tone of shared grievance, those are all clues pointing to a specific informed audience, not a broad one. Wrong answers will offer an audience that's too general or will describe an audience whose values contradict the writer's clearly sympathetic appeals. A third common mistake is conflating the speaker's identity with their ethos. The speaker might be a well-known historical figure, but what matters for the exam is how they construct authority within this specific text. An MCQ might ask how the author establishes credibility, and the right answer will point to a textual strategy citing personal experience, referencing evidence, acknowledging counter-arguments rather than relying on the speaker's external reputation. Connecting rhetorical situation to the rest of the course. Rhetorical situation is genuinely the spine of AP language. Everything else in this course, the appeals of ethos, pathos, and logos from Unit 1, the claims and evidence structures in Unit 3, the style and syntax analysis in Units 5 and 6, only make sense in relation to the rhetorical situation. When you're analyzing why a writer uses an emotional anecdote, the complete answer isn't just to appeal to pathos, it's to appeal to pathos for this specific audience in this specific context in order to accomplish this specific purpose. The rhetorical situation is always the frame inside which every other analytical move happens. In free response questions, this matters just as much. Rubrics for the rhetorical analysis essay explicitly reward students who connect rhetorical choices back to how they serve the speaker's purpose and address the audience. But even in the MCQ section, every time you see a question asking why does the author do something, the deepest, most reliable answer will run through the rhetorical situation. Think of it this way. The rhetorical situation is your compass. Before you can analyze the terrain, you need to know which direction you're facing. Moving forward, now that you can identify the full rhetorical situation in a passage, the next step is learning how to trace the specific strategies writers use to respond to that situation, which is exactly where our exploration of claims, evidence, and lines of reasoning picks up from here.